After the grim reception of Dead to Rights 2 and Reckoning in 2005, the franchise's flame was already flickering at its weakest. Most had written it off, another action series buried beneath the rubble of forgotten titles. But then, quietly and without ceremony, something stirred. Against all odds, the name returned, and so did Jack, alongside his loyal companion, Shadow. One last job, one final descent into Grand City. This would be the closing chapter of the Dead to Rights saga, a series that never got the chance to truly flourish despite a final attempt to resuscitate a legacy already gone cold. This is the untold story of Dead to Rights Retribution, the revival few noticed, and the legacy that vanished in silence. After securing a firm grip on the family-friendly market, BradyGames turned its gaze toward a different territory, the mature audience. On September 16, 2005, Volatile Games was born, a newly formed subsidiary created to explore darker themes, adult storytelling, and violent gameplay that stood in sharp contrast to Blitz's motto. Volatile's foray into the spotlight came with Reservoir Dogs, a video game adaptation of Quentin Tarantino's cult classic film. But it wasn't the name alone that made headlines. It was the game's raw depiction of brutality. The game's unflinching portrayal of violence and cruelty sparked immediate controversy. Australia and New Zealand banned it outright. In Germany, the title was added to the list of media harmful to young persons. Yet rather than retreat, Volatile Games leaned into the backlash. The reaction became part of the studio's identity. It was never meant to play it safe. This wasn't a studio chasing safe numbers or soft acclaim. It was one intent on delivering raw, brutal, and boundary-pushing titles, made for those who wanted something grittier than the market typically allowed. Once work on Reservoir Dogs came to a close, Volatile Games shifted its focus to a far more ambitious idea, a project simply known as Possession. Players would take control of a demonic force, raising the dead and commanding an army of the infected in a city under siege. It was an interesting idea full of promise. The surviving footage, preserved in a preview by IGN, showed glimpses of something special, but the game never left the ground. There was another project, one so obscure it has remained virtually undocumented, Hannibal the Conqueror. A game based on Vin Diesel's ill-fated movie of the same name was quietly in development before vanishing without a trace. No official records, no developer interviews, no gameplay details, nothing. Only a trailer I've discovered, the last surviving glimpse of what could have been. Possession was initially pitched to Bandai Namco America, but the publisher ultimately considered it too expensive to pursue. Yet, rather than severe ties, Bandai Namco of America offered Volatile a different opportunity, one that would change the studio's trajectory. They invited them to pitch a new Dead to Rights title, and that's where our story truly begins. Development on a new Dead to Rights installment began in early 2007 under the codename Dead to Rights Redemption. But how did Redemption come to be? What set the gears of production in motion? Emery Jelly, project director, shared the story in an interview with Agrogamer. The Dead to Rights franchise has never really been forgotten about. Namco looked at several ideas over the years but wasn't really able to find one to meet their high expectations for this new episode. BradyGames Studios had some ongoing projects with Namco Bandai Games America, and in one of our meetings, our Volatile Games division proposed a complete reboot of the Dead to Rights franchise, reimagining the story from day one and rebuilding the gameplay from scratch. With that, production on Dead to Rights Redemption started. Early concept designs from March of that year reveal a very different look for Jack Slade. He appeared leaner, younger, and dressed in a detective-style coat, far removed from the imposing figure he would eventually become. Even the early artwork shared by Volatile Games reflected this direction, but as development progressed, Jack's design evolved. The final version transformed him into something more akin to a hybrid of the Punisher and Batman, an almost mythic enforcer of justice, towering with raw muscle, draped in tactical gear, and built for war. Yet beneath the aesthetic changes, the core of Dead to Rights remained intact. Grand City, brutal takedowns, fluid hand-to-hand combat, and Jack's loyal companion Shadow were all fundamental pillars from the very beginning. But not everything envisioned in those early days made it to the final game. One such omission was a morality system known as vengeance or justice. At key moments, Jack would have the choice to execute criminals or take them in alive, with his decision influencing the flow of the game. As we dug deeper, it became clear that a wealth of mechanics never made it past the drawing board. Shadow was originally intended to do more than attack and search. He could alert Jack to nearby items and threats, and even jump to traverse obstacles. An adrenaline system was considered, along with early ideas for multiplayer. However, none of these planned features survived. In my conversation with story writer and assistant lead designer Ben Fisher, he revealed many interesting facts about the making of Dead to Rights Retribution, from the stylistic pillars that gave the game its brooding identity to the ideas cut midway in development. Let's begin with the cut co-op idea, where players could have had the option to switch between Jack and Shadow on the fly. We did prototype it. We set up an encounter where you could play as Jack or Shadow, and did have a debug option to let you switch at will. It was quite interesting, but didn't quite hit the mark. It hit the usual problem with co-op AI. You didn't want Jack to have all the fun while you just watched, but you also wanted him to feel like Jack. There's not an easy compromise to these competing desires. Ben Fisher went deeper and pulled back the curtain on the project's earliest form. The original concept, titled Dead to Rights Redemption, was envisioned as a more grounded and somber reboot, one stripped of the excess and leaning more into grit over spectacle. But Namco of America had other plans. They wanted something that aligned more closely with the company's philosophy: louder, broader, more marketable, and a hero made for war. With a producer change at Namco US, the game shifted more towards a core Namco tone. What they had in mind was more like Tekken, so we layered up some of the more operatic tone over time. In fact, you can see the roots of a more grounded tone in the mo-capped cutscenes, because they were recorded first. I spent a long time watching every classic noir movie I could find, 3 a night at one point. Slowly but surely, the game's DNA began to shift. Redemption became Retribution, and with that came an evolution, not just in tone, but in the very shape of its protagonist. Fisher recalls the metamorphosis with surgical clarity. From a narrative perspective, the Punisher tone built up over time, so it wasn't a clear reference at first. In fact, the original plan was a much more grounded reboot. You can see some of this tone in the behind-the-scenes footage. A useful reference point we discussed was Casino Royale, which came out during pre-production of Dead to Rights. My favorite tone shift moment was the helicopter indoors boss fight that was initially a much more grounded encounter versus the GAC. It's telling. Casino Royale, a film that redefined James Bond with stripped down brutality and emotional rawness, served as the touchstone, but over time, that sharp internal pain gave way to something more external and punishing. The grief stayed, but it put on muscle. The tragedy matured into fury, and Jack's slate, once a vessel for a noir tale of loss, became a weaponized monument to it. A city is more than just its skyline. It's the pulse of its streets, the weight of its history, and the unspoken stories unfolding in the shadows. For Detroit's Retribution, the challenge wasn't just designing a grand city, it was making it feel alive. The developers wanted more than just a backdrop, they wanted a city that felt corrupt, oppressive, and suffocating. A place that wasn't just inhabited, but haunted by crime, where justice was little more than a fleeting illusion. Every alley, every neon-lit boulevard, every run-down tenement had to feel like a world teetering on the edge. The team looked at noir inspirations, drawing from films and graphic novels that captured the essence of a city drowning in its own sins. But translating that into gameplay was another challenge entirely. We wanted the art direction of the game to be very much a stylish dystopia based broadly on film noir and neo-noir. Concept artist Bob Shisher explained. This took in concepts such as Fritz Lang's Metropolis as well as German Expressionism, and architectural styles from Beaux Arts, Neo-Gothic, and Structural Expressionism. Grand City wasn't just a setting, it was a living, rotten entity. Volatile Games didn't just build streets and skyscrapers, they wove a story into every shadow-drenched alley and flickering neon sign. Decay, abandonment, corruption, and unshakable sense of evil bled into the environment, whispering the city's grim history without a single word. Light and shadow weren't just aesthetic choices, they were weapons, shaping the very soul of Grand City and reinforcing the bleak reality Jack Slade was forced to navigate. Metropolis suggested the exaggerated scale as well as visually explores the juxtaposition of the haves and the have-nots, a theme to which Detroit's Retribution returns to through the game, from artists such as Edward Munch as well as films like Nosferatu. We took the bold use of shadow and strong contrasts between light and dark, which we found again in the work of relatively more recent painters such as Edward Hopper. Emery Gilley expands on this by adding a few of his favorite inspirations, saying, I always say when someone says, oh, Grand City looks like Gotham, or when someone says, your game feels like Sin City, I always say, I'm going to hug you, man. It's such an honor to hear that. I don't think that we have one specific game or one specific movie which is like a direct source, which we said, this is it. But I can tell you that for me personally, movies like Casablanca or LA Confidential, for me, that is quality, that is style, that is class, really. We wanted to have that kind of sophistications in the visual art style and the storytelling and even in the complexity of the game design. Fans of the Detroit franchise always praised its third-person shooting, with some still considering it among the best in the genre. But when it came to hand-to-hand combat, the cracks began to show. Volatile Games saw the gap and set out to fix it by revamping the system from the ground up. At the time, few games blended shooting and hand-to-hand combat in a way that felt seamless, striking the right balance between gameplay and brutal melee encounters required more than just iteration, it needed inspiration. To achieve the weight and fluidity they envisioned, the team looked beyond traditional shooters, drawing inspiration from all sorts of fighting games and also beat-em-ups. They wanted every punch, every grapple, and every gunshot to feel deliberate and impactful. Story writer and designer Ben Fisher shared some insights with me, saying, from a gameplay perspective, there weren't any straight-line influences because there are so few games that blend melee and ranged. Really, we were looking to do Streets of Rage 2 with guns on some level. We spent lunch times playing Street Fighter 3, looking at character design and combat pacing. God of War was a useful reference point because there were Gamasutra articles online written by the combat designers. Gunplay and brutal melee combat were at the heart of Dead to Rights Retribution, but Jack wasn't the only force to be reckoned with. Shadow, his ever-loyal companion, wasn't just a tool, he was a terror. In the original game, he was your trusted enforcer, leaping onto enemies and ripping them apart to retrieve their weapons. In Retribution, he evolved into something more, a predator, a killing machine, your killing machine. But bringing Shadow to life wasn't just about making him deadly. According to Emery Jelly, the project director, one of the greatest challenges was making players care about him. It wasn't enough for Shadow to be intelligent or mechanically useful. He had to feel indispensable, the kind of partner you'd instinctively rely on, not just for survival, but for absolute control over the battlefield. Ultimately, they succeeded. Shadow wasn't just reliable, he was essential. He could silently take down enemies while Jack shattered bones in the foreground. He could also cause distractions, creating openings for a well-placed headshot, but it was in his own stealth-driven sequences where he shed the guise of a companion and became a force of nature, a relentless predator lurking in the dark, picking off enemies one by one. The hunter became the hunted. In my conversation with Ben Fisher, Ben revealed that they drew inspiration from Batman Arkham Asylum. Shadow-handing was a difficult problem to solve, and we tried a few different things, eventually settling on handing similar to The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess because it was the most flexible. The Shadow can hear heartbeats idea was inspired by the stealth mechanics of Arkham Asylum, which came out close to the end of Dead to Rights. We already had the Fresnel silhouette, but the heart was a nice extra touch. From everything we've uncovered, Dead to Rights Retribution was shaping up to be the best entry in the series, and for those who had followed Jack and Shadow through the years, or even harbored the faintest nostalgia for their brutal brand of justice, their anticipation was at a fever pitch.
Send SWAT to back me up if they ever show. I'm giving you a direct order, Detective. You go in there, I'm taking your shield and your gun.
Here, you point it in that direction, and you pull this to make it go bang. Feel free to point it at a bad guy, if you ever end up facing one.
On February 2009, Destructoid broke the news. Bandai Namco was dusting off a vault of dormant IPs, and among them was Dead to Rights. The franchise was set to make a grand return, reimagined with fresh mechanics, modernized visuals, and a promise of rebirth. A press release from Namco of America confirmed that Dead to Rights would be back in the fall of 2009. Upon hearing the news, gaming publications took notice. Preview images filled the pages of magazines, and print ads secured space in Play, PlayStation Raw, and Game Informer, among others. But despite its presence in print, Dead to Rights Retribution struggled for visibility. The reason? A storm of industry titans overshadowed it. Red Dead Redemption had the spotlight, and alongside it, an onslaught of heavyweights: Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, Fallout New Vegas, Halo Reach, and God of War 3. In a battlefield of giants, Dead to Rights Retribution barely had room to breathe. As fall 2009 approached, Dead to Rights Retribution was nowhere to be seen. It wasn't until Destructoid reported that the game had been delayed to 2010 without a clear release window that fans finally had an answer. For the few who had been eagerly awaiting Jack and Shadow's return, all that was left to do was wait.
After nearly 3 years in development, Dead to Rights returned to action in April 2010 across America, Europe, Australia, and South Korea, with Japan following in July. However, Germany wasn't part of the rollout, as Volatile Games refused to censor the game to meet the country's strict USK rating. Critically, the game's reception was mixed. While some critics and players appreciated the game's return, others cast it aside like an old relic. Still, for many, this revival was far more well received than its predecessor, Dead to Rights 2. Commercially, however, the story was different. From the very beginning, Dead to Rights Retribution found itself struggling to cross a vast chasm of competition. In the UK, the game debuted at number 30, then quickly faded from sight. In Japan, it moved a few copies, reaching 20,000 units over several months before disappearing. In America, it was barely a blip on the radar, with sales languishing in the low thousands. When compared to the blockbuster titles released during the same period, Dead to Rights Retribution clearly trailed behind. To keep the game's pulse alive, Volatile Games released the GAC Pack DLC in June of that year. However, it did little to shift the needle. Namco of America had expected Dead to Rights Retribution to cross the 1 million mark, yet by the end of its run in 2010, it had only managed to move 400,000 copies. Since Dead to Rights Retribution, the franchise has remained buried. Outside of a few hopeful cries from fans, Bandai Namco has shown no interest in reviving the franchise. The company quietly renews the trademark every few years, but beyond that, it's been radio silence. No press releases, no social media posts, no anniversary shoutouts, nothing. After Dead to Rights Retribution's release, there were no concrete plans for a follow-up. However, Ben Fisher did reveal that the team at Volatile Games had toyed with several ideas, one of which involved a deeper dive into the past, a prequel centered on Frank Slade and the origins of his bond with Shadow. There were no firm plans for a sequel, Ben explained, but you always leave the door open for the possibility. At one point, we also discussed the idea of a prequel where you played as Frank Slade. In the DLC, we also introduced playable characters from the GAC. If I recall correctly, we had a few other pitches for little vignette stories set around Grand City. Like every Dead to Rights fan, I asked for more insights about the prequel idea, to which Ben Fisher replied. As for Dead to Rights prequel, you can see some of the ideas we talked about loosely as collectibles in Retribution. Frank as a younger man finding Shadow, being the mean one. They were all very loose ideas at that stage though. Will Dead to Rights return? Nobody knows. But when I spoke to story and designer Ben Fisher, he expressed his desire to create a spiritual successor one day. Until that day comes, the only thing fans can do is wait and wonder if there are still stories left to tell in the streets of Grand City.